They said the Sawtooth Mountains swallowed their secrets in snow. But on a storm-choked night, when a battle-worn veteran rode his scarred black horse into the blizzard, he found something no man was meant to see. A forest ranger bleeding out beneath the pines, her life slipping away with every single breath. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a collision of past ghosts, desperate survival, and a force of nature so fierce it would leave an entire town questioning where the line between man, beast, and legend truly lies. The Sawtooth Mountains were buried under a winter silence so heavy it felt like iron. Peaks rose like jagged teeth against a swollen grey sky. A sky that looked older than time itself, pregnant with snow it refused to release. When the storm finally broke, it came slow, patient, deliberate. Snow didn't fall in playful flurries. It fell in thick, heavy sheets, a grim ritual that smothered the world. It blanketed the valley floor and the high ridges until the ancient pines were nothing but statues carved from shadow and frost. Their boughs sagged, creaking under the weight, but they didn't break. They'd stood for centuries. They would stand through this. The land was so still you'd swear the earth itself was holding its breath. No bird stirred, no wolf howled, only the wind moved, a ghostly hymn threading through the canyons, scouring rock before vanishing into the endless silence. Tucked against one of those slopes was a cabin. Small, weather-worn, its walls made from hand-cut logs chinked with clay and moss. It clung to the ridge the way stubborn men cling to their last convictions. Smoke drifted from its stovepipe, a thin grey ribbon shredded to nothing by the wind. In the storm, it looked less like a home and more like a forgotten relic. Inside sat Jonah McCreary, 58 years old, tall but wiry, his frame bent slightly from carrying burdens far heavier than any pack. A soldier's life, and everything that came after, had taken the square from his shoulders, replacing it with scars. His hair was grey-flecked, cropped close, a habit he never broke from the army. Deep lines were carved into his face by sun, wind, and grief. A jagged scar ran from his jaw to his ear, an old wound that never quite healed. Jonah sat hunched over a scarred wooden table, writing in a notebook so old the spine had cracked. He pressed each word into the paper with a dull pencil, trying to pin down memories before they slipped away for good. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and damp wool. A cast-iron stove in the corner glowed faintly, the only warmth in the room. The only light came from a single oil lamp, its flame trembling, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Shelves with jars of beans, an old rifle in the corner, a pair of boots by the hearth. There were no photos, no ornaments, just the essentials, and the silence. But Jonah wasn't entirely alone. Outside, in the snow-choked clearing, another presence stood guard. His name was Eclipse. To call him just a horse felt like an insult. He stood 18 hands at the shoulder, a colossus of muscle and bone cloaked in a coat as black as coal. His mane was a tangled dark banner whipping in the wind. A pale, rope-like scar ran across his chest, the mark of an old fight only Jonah knew about. Eclipse stood motionless in the storm, breath pluming in great clouds of vapor. He was planted in the snow, head high, ears flicking at every sound. He looked less like an animal and more like an ancient sentinel, a guardian shaped from the same darkness that wrapped the mountains. His amber eyes glowed in the faint lamplight from the cabin, reflecting an intelligence that went far beyond simple instinct. Jonah had found him years ago, half wild, scarred, and limping on a ridgeline after a fire. Most men would have left him to die. Jonah didn't. And Eclipse had never left his side since. The night deepened. Jonah scratched one last line into his notebook and leaned back, listening. Not for sound, but for the shift in the silence that meant the world had changed. And then it came. A single gunshot. It cracked the night open like a whip. The echo bounced off the ridges, a sharp, angry bark that tore the silence to shreds. Then, just as fast, the storm swallowed it whole. But the damage was done. Something out there in the white was broken. Eclipse reacted first. His head snapped toward the sound, ears rigid. He slammed a hoof into the frozen ground, a drumbeat of warning. Steam burst from his flaring nostrils in short, furious blasts. Inside, Jonah froze. The pencil hung in his hand. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing toward the window as if he could pierce the dark with his gaze alone. The soldier in his bones, long dormant, stirred awake. His heartbeat slowed, his focus sharpened. Another moment passed, only the wind. Then Eclipse stamped again, restless. Jonah set the pencil down. It rolled across the page, smudging a half-written word. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff but precise. He grabbed his heavy coat, shrugging into it. His hand found the pistol on the nail by the door without hesitation. He checked the chamber and slid it into the worn holster at his side. He slipped a folding knife into his pocket. Jonah opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stinging ice biting his cheeks. Eclipse was waiting. The massive horse shifted, muscles rippling under his black coat. His eyes found Jonah's. No panic, only readiness. Jonah walked to him, his boots crunching in the snow, and placed a calloused hand on his neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low gravel. "Show me." Eclipse tossed his head, snorted, and turned toward the timberline. Jonah swung into the saddle, the movement fluid, instinctual. The horse lunged forward, hooves tearing into the snow, carrying them into the heart of the storm. The cabin and its small light shrank behind them, swallowed by the wilderness. The forest closed in, black columns rising into the swirling white. The forest swallowed them whole. Snow streamed past Jonah's face in stinging sheets, finding every crack in his coat. He ducked low over Eclipse's powerful neck, the beam of a small torch cutting a dim tunnel through the blizzard. The world was shadow and noise. Wind shrieked through the treetops, branches rattling like bones. The only other sound was the hollow drumming of hooves on frozen earth. Jonah guided Eclipse by weight, not by rain. He'd learned long ago that in a storm like this, the animal's instincts were sharper than any man's. Then he smelled it. Something sharp, cutting through the cold scent of pine and ice. Acrid, metallic, gunpowder, and beneath it, faint but undeniable, the copper tang of blood. He strained his ears past the wind's roar. The forest had changed. Something human had gone violently wrong out here. "Someone's down," Jonah muttered, the words stolen by the wind. But Eclipse heard, or maybe he just felt the gravity of it. He slowed abruptly, planting his hooves. He gave a short, urgent whinny, ears swiveling forward. Jonah's torch beam skimmed across the ground. The snow was disturbed, scuffed, dragged, broken. And then he saw it. A trail, not the clean lines of skis or the neat prints of boots. This was ugly. A long, uneven gouge cut into the snow, winding between the trees. Something had been dragged. Or someone. Dark stains speckled the white along its length. Blood. Not yet frozen, not old. Jonah's hand went to the pistol at his side. He angled the torch along the scarred path until it vanished deeper into the trees. "Easy," he murmured again, pressing a hand to Eclipse's neck. The horse lowered his muzzle, nostrils quivering, drawing in the same bitter scent. Then, with a snort, he began to follow. The trail ended at the base of a towering pine. Jonah swung down from the saddle, moving low and quick, the way he'd been trained. His torchlight found the figure almost at once. A woman lay crumpled in a drift, one arm flung out as if she'd tried to crawl. Her forest-green coat was ripped and dark, with spreading patches of blood. She was a ranger. He could just make out the badge, half hidden. She'd stumbled into something lethal. He knelt beside her, pushing the torch between his teeth to free his hands. His fingers went to her neck, pressing hard. There. A pulse, weak, fluttering, but there. Her lips moved. He bent close, his ear almost to her mouth. The words came in a broken rasp, barely audible over the storm. "Trail. Smugglers." Her eyes rolled back, and her head slumped against the snow. Behind him, Eclipse shifted, the crunch of hooves loud in the sudden hush. The horse's ears were rigid, his breath coming in rapid, steaming bursts. Jonah felt the heat of it on the back of his neck, as if the animal were watching over his shoulder. There was no time to think. His training took over, sharp and automatic. He pulled his knife, cutting through the torn fabric of her coat. The wound was at her side, just below her ribs. Blood welled sluggishly, too much, too fast. Jonah pressed the heel of his hand hard against it, clamping down. He rummaged through his pockets, found a strip of an old scarf, folded it, shoved it under his palm, and pressed again. "Stay with me, Ranger," he muttered, his voice rough. "You're not done yet. Not tonight." His calloused hands shook just slightly. It had been years since he'd felt the heat of living blood pumping through his fingers. Years since the last body he touched still had a life to lose. The Ranger stirred weakly, her face pale, her lips blue. "You hold on," he said, leaning closer. "Hear me? You hold on." A rush of warmth brushed her cheek. Jonah looked up. Eclipse had lowered his massive head, pressing his muzzle near her face, his warm breath rolling over her skin. The horse's amber eyes were locked on her, as if willing her to stay. For a split second, another image flashed in Jonah's mind. A different black horse, Midnight, his war horse from Afghanistan. Midnight, yanking him free from a minefield as explosions rained down. Midnight had saved him, only to be torn apart moments later. The memory was a raw, open wound. He forced it back, focusing on the dying woman beneath his hands. The wind shifted, the snow whipping sideways in fierce sheets. The storm was coming in full force. He couldn't take her back to the cabin. It was too far. She'd never survived the ride. He closed his eyes, searching his mental map of the ridge. There. A shallow cave, a hunter's landmark. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He stripped off his own heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around her. He used his belt to bind it, securing pressure on the wound. Grunting with effort, he hauled her up, cradling her against his chest. "Damn stubborn girl," he muttered, "picking fights you can't finish." Eclipse stepped closer, lowering himself just enough for Jonah to heave the woman across the saddle. He secured her with leather ties, making sure she wouldn't slide. Her head lolled against the horse's neck, dark hair plastered to her face. Jonah checked the knots one last time, then laid a firm hand on Eclipse's shoulder. "Easy, boy. Take us there." The horse gave a low, rolling neigh and lunged forward into the blizzard. The forest swallowed them again. Snow battered Jonah's face, but Eclipse didn't falter, his body a relentless engine of power plowing a path through the drifts. Jonah hunched low, one arm tight around the ranger's body. Behind them, the trail of blood and hoofprints was already vanishing, erased by the storm. Soon there would be no sign they were ever there. Just the storm, the forest, and the scent of danger that refused to fade. The cave mouth was a jagged black wound in the rock, its edges hung with icicles like fangs. Jonah pulled Eclipse to a halt. The black horse's sides were heaving, breath exploding in white gusts. Jonah slid from the saddle and carefully lifted the ranger's limp form. Her name was Clara, he'd learn later. For now, she was just a fragile weight in his arms, a life threatening to slip away. He ducked into the cave. Inside, it was narrow but deep enough to break the wind. The air was cool and stale, but it was a reprieve. He laid her gently on the ground, spreading a bed of dry pine needles he'd carried in his pack. A shadow filled the entrance. Eclipse pushed his massive frame inside with surprising care, his bulk all but sealing the opening. The horse exhaled heavily, and Jonah felt as if the animal had just turned this simple cave into a fortress. Three beings, man, woman, and beast, huddled together against the world. Jonah wasted no time. He pulled dry twigs and bark from his satchel, arranging them with practiced precision. A flint sparked, and a small flame licked upward, casting trembling orange light across the stone walls. He laid his own coat across Clara's chest. The bleeding had slowed, his makeshift bandage had bought her time, but her skin was clammy, her lips pale. He warmed some water over the fire, dipped a cloth in it, and carefully wiped the dried blood from her side. She didn't stir. He looked at her face, softened by unconsciousness, then down at his own calloused, trembling hands. It had been years since these hands had tried to hold a life inside another body. "Not on my watch," he muttered, the words a vow. The fire flared, illuminating the jagged scar on his jaw and the black horse standing silent guard. Eclipse remained at the cave mouth, eyes glowing like embers, ears tuned to every sound from the storm. Time blurred. Jonah fought exhaustion, his eyes fixed on Clara. He almost missed it when she stirred. A faint moan escaped her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, then sharpened with pain. She tried to move. "Easy," Jonah said, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Don't fight it." He lifted a tin cup of warm water to her lips. She drank, then sagged back. "I was on their trail," she rasped, each word a struggle. "Smugglers. They found me." Jonah nodded grimly. It confirmed his fears. Violence, pursuit, no mercy. "Illegal logging," she forced out. "Rare timber. They're armed." A shiver ran through her. "They don't leave witnesses." Jonah's expression darkened. He'd seen men like that before, in other wars, on other continents. Men who stripped the land and killed to cover their tracks. The cave fell quiet. He found himself wanting her to keep talking, to stay tethered to the world. So when her gaze flicked toward him, he began to speak. "I was in Afghanistan," he said, his voice low and rough. "Special ops. Thought I'd seen it all. Then one night, we walked right into an ambush." Clara's eyes, though heavy, searched his face. Jonah stared into the fire. "Men dropped all around me. I ran into a minefield. Didn't realize it till I was in it. Couldn't move. Just waited for the end." The fire snapped. But there was a horse, Midnight. A faint, brittle smile touched his lips. "He belonged to one of our Afghan contacts, not even trained for combat, just loyal. He came for me, pulled me out by the straps of my vest." His throat tightened. "He saved me, but he didn't make it. Took shrapnel in the next blast. Gone." The memory hollowed him out. He looked at Eclipse, standing guard. "I swore I'd never ride again. Couldn't stand the sight of a horse. But then, Eclipse found me. Big black bastard wouldn't leave my land, day after day. One morning I saddled him just to shut him up. Been with me ever since." Clara followed his gaze. She understood then. This horse wasn't just a companion. He was a living bridge to a grief that had never healed. After a long silence, she gave a faint, weak laugh. "My father was a ranger," she said, her voice steadier. "Boise National. He loved these forests more than anything." She swallowed hard. "When I was 14, there was a fire, the worst I'd ever seen. He ran in to pull a trapped crew out. He never came back. They just found his badge in the ashes." Her fingers twitched. "I thought if I took this job, if I kept the forest safe, I could keep him alive somehow. A fool's bargain, maybe." Jonah looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, the raw ache in her eyes. He saw himself reflected there. "I guess we're both just what's left after loss," she whispered. Jonah met her gaze. "We're survivors, Clara. That's why we can't quit." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before her eyes slipped closed again. From the cave mouth came a deep rumble from Eclipse, half whinny, half growl. He stamped a hoof against the stone. It was an affirmation, a seal on their shared vow. Jonah leaned back against the wall, weary but alert. In the dying light of the fire, a fragile bond had been forged between two strangers and a silent, watchful guardian. They were no longer alone in their grief. The fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, its light barely licking the snow outside the cave entrance. The night was deeper now, colder. Jonah sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees. Clara dozed fitfully, her breathing shallow but steady. Eclipse stood like a black monument at the mouth of the cave, sealing half the opening, his breath fogging the dark. It was close to midnight when everything changed. Eclipse's ears flicked forward, then pinned back. The horse shifted his weight, a low vibration rumbling in his chest. Jonah lifted his head, listening. Beneath the moan of the wind, there was another sound. Softer, irregular. Crunch, crunch. Boots on snow. He eased to his feet, slow and silent. A faint glow moved between the trees, too low and steady for lightning. Flashlights. Jonah's jaw clenched. Two figures emerged from the storm, bundled in bright orange jackets that looked absurdly out of place. Hikers. He should have expected it. The sawtooth drew the ambitious even in winter, but the timing was disastrous. "Someone's camping," a woman's voice carried on the wind, puzzled. "Could be someone in trouble," a man replied. Eclipse stamped a hoof on the stone, the crack echoing in the small space. His body swelled, nostrils flaring. Inside the cave, Clara gasped, her hand gripping Jonah's wrist with surprising strength. Her wide, frantic eyes asked the question for her. "Are we found?" Jonah squeezed her fingers once. "Stay still." He set his rifle aside and stepped toward the entrance. The hiker's flashlight beams swept closer, scattering against the wall of Eclipse's body. One ray almost pierced the darkness, almost caught the pale outline of Clara on her bed of pine needles. Jonah moved fast, planting himself in the gap. "Just a fire," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Keep moving. East trail." The couple froze, their lights bobbing. "We saw smoke," the man said, half defensive. "We thought maybe—" "It's handled," Jonah cut him off, folding his arms. His tone left no room for argument. "Keep moving." The silence stretched, thick with tension. "Ben," the woman whispered, "maybe we should—" She broke off with a startled cry. Eclipse had moved. The horse thrust half his body into the open, head tossing, eyes blazing gold in the firelight. He slammed one hoof down, the sound like a hammer blow splitting the night. Snow sprayed around the couple's boots. The woman shrieked, "Ben, that's not just a horse." Ben's face was pale. He stammered, tugged her arm, and pulled her back into the snow. "We're going. East Trail." "Yeah." They retreated quickly, their orange jackets and bobbing lights swallowed by the storm. Only when they were gone did Jonah exhale. He turned back into the cave. "That was close," Clara whispered, her breathing still ragged. "Too close," Jonah agreed. But Eclipse hadn't relaxed. The horse stood tall, head high, ears pricked, testing the air. Then he gave a low, guttural sound. Not a whinny. Something deeper, primal. Steam burst from his muzzle. Jonah frowned, stepping to the horse's side, pressing his own face into the wind. He sniffed the air. The hikers had smelled of sweat and fear. But this was different. Acrid, sharp, familiar, gunpowder. The old smoke clung to the storm, carried on invisible hands. "They're close," Jonah murmured, his voice laced with the certainty of a soldier naming an incoming strike. Clara's fingers tightened on the small knife Jonah had given her. "The smugglers." Jonah snapped into motion. He doused the fire with water from his canteen, plunging the cave into near darkness. Only a faint red glow remained, a dying heart pulsing under the ash. "Help me," he said, his voice urgent but calm. They worked in silence. Clara, despite the pain lancing through her, forced herself upright. Jonah handed her branches, and she helped stack them against the entrance, packing snow into the gaps. They worked to disguise the opening, to make it look like a collapsed, abandoned ledge. Eclipse helped, leaning his massive shoulder into the branches, pressing them into place with sheer force. "He knows," Jonah muttered. "If they see the fire, we're dead," Clara whispered. Jonah gave a sharp nod. At last, the entrance was camouflaged. From the outside, it was just a drift of snow against bare rock. Clara sank to her knees again, clutching the knife, pale but resolute. Eclipse planted himself at the entrance once more, a wall of muscle and vigilance, his eyes glowing like twin lanterns in the dark. Jonah checked his pistol, then slung the rifle across his chest. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. The battle was coming to them. Outside, the storm roared. Inside the cave, man, woman, and beast waited. And in that waiting, the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. Dawn didn't arrive so much as thin the darkness into a grey that felt older than light. The storm had settled, the wind a sullen whisper. The air tasted of scorched metal. Jonah stood just inside the camouflaged entrance, watching the world through a lattice of branches. Clara was awake, knife in hand, her breathing shallow. Eclipse blocked the rest of the opening with his bulk, a slab of living night. At first, there was only the sound of winter. Then came a rhythm no storm makes, steady, deliberate, boots crunching on snow. Jonah's chest tightened. He didn't need to look at Clara. Her breathing had stopped. Eclipse's ears tipped forward like twin arrows. Shapes resolved out of the grey. 4 of them. Dark coats, hoods up, weapons slung with a casual deadliness. They moved in a tight pattern that screamed training and bad intentions. Leading them was a man with a scar like a slash of ice across his cheek. Cole Maddox. He didn't scan the forest like a hunter. He surveyed it like an owner. They stopped 10 yards out. One of them, a shorter man, squatted and touched the snow. Jonah knew what he was pointing at, a faint brownish-red smear where Clara's blood had stained the ground. The man stood, tapped his thigh twice. Cole's mouth twitched. "Someone's here," he said, his voice level and bored. "Hurt. Won't get far." He glanced at the brush-choked hole in the rock. He didn't blink. He just rolled his wrist, and his men shifted formation. Two out wide, one angling left, the short one advancing with Cole. It was a professional ambush. In the cave, Clara's fingers whitened on her knife. "They found us," she whispered. Jonah's answer was the click of his own thoughts settling into place. His hand eased to his pistol, not drawing. Not yet. He inhaled, slow and steady, riding the thin edge between fear and focus. Eclipse struck the stone floor with a hoof. The sound slammed out of the cave, a crack like a hammer on an anvil. The horse's deep rumble followed, ricocheting off the rock faces. The smugglers flinched. Even men who didn't fear much feared the unknown, especially when it sounded like a legend waking up. Cole's glance cut toward the entrance, then back to his men. He lifted his pistol, letting it hang. "Big horse," he said, a smirk touching his lips. "Won't stop a bullet." Maybe not, but even Cole's eyes narrowed when Eclipse stepped forward, just enough for those molten gold eyes to be seen through the branches. Then Jonah stepped into view, ghosting out of the cave. He held his rifle low but ready. "Back off," he said, his gravelly voice carrying across the clearing. To underline the point, he leveled the barrel at the sky and fired once. The report tore the dawn in half. Cole didn't flinch. He brought his pistol up, cool as a clock. Inside, he ordered his crew, "Drag them out." The world compressed to the space between heartbeats. Jonah risked one look back through the brush and met Clara's eyes. He lifted his chin once. "Be ready." Eclipse lowered his head and pawed the rock. "Try me." The smugglers fanned out, smooth and efficient. The wind paused. Then Cole lifted his chin, and all hell broke loose. The short man surged first, a knife flashing. Jonah sidestepped, and years of training fused into one brutal motion. He brought the butt of his rifle around in a vicious arc. The wood met ribs with a sickening crack. Air burst out of the man as he crumpled to the snow and stayed there. "Jonah!" Clara's voice was a thread of pain. He didn't turn. Another smuggler had his pistol up, aimed at Jonah, but before he could fire, Clara moved. She had Jonah's sidearm clamped in her hand. Her arm shook, but she drew a breath that felt like being stabbed and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her. The shot echoed. The man jerked, a dark flower blooming on his shoulder. His gun fell into a snowdrift. He collapsed to his knees, his mouth opening and closing silently. Shock washed over Clara's face, then was replaced by a rush of adrenaline. Her eyes were hard. "Good," Jonah said without looking. A third man was moving along the rocks, trying to flank him. He got close, the flashlight on his shoulder painting the brush with hard white light, close enough for Clara to see his face. The light swept through the branches and hit him full on. She stopped breathing. Reed. The name hung in the air. Reed Holbrook. The boy from high school, the one who'd helped her carry books down the hall when the world was still simple. His face was harder now, the laughter gone from his eyes. "Should have stayed out of it, Clara," he said. The words like a file on old metal. He came at the branches, pistol not yet raised, a strange mercy or a cold calculation. Clara braced herself and met him as he pushed through. The world narrowed to the scrape of boots and the feel of her knife in his grip. Reed's hand clamped on her wrist, driving the blade toward the rock. Pain exploded in her side, but she leaned into it, teeth clenched. "Don't," she gritted out, trying to shove his gun hand down. "Too late," he grunted. They staggered, fighting for purchase in the snow. She dropped her weight, pivoted, and drove her shoulder into his chest. They fell together. The pistol slipped from his grip. Clara rolled, gasped as fire ran along her ribs, and brought her knee up hard into his arm. He yelped. "Stop," she said, the word bigger than her body. "Don't make me." He looked up at her from the snow, shame moving like a shadow across his face. He didn't say sorry. He just lay still. On the other side of the brush, the last man had made his move. He slid along the cave's right side, in Jonah's blind spot, a knife in his hand. He drew a breath to steady himself for the kill. and the cave breathed louder. A shape that had been rock and shadow surged forward. Eclipse. The horse filled the gap, his black armored chest punching the daylight out of the space. The man's eyes went wide. His knife was a toy. Eclipse's shoulder hit him mid-back with the force of a falling tree. The man went down hard. He tried to roll, but Eclipse brought a forehoof down, striking the ground an inch from his ear. The stone cracked. The threat was so precise it was terrifying. The man's hands shot up, palms to the sky. "Okay, okay." Eclipse lowered his head, his hot breath rocking the man's hair, a deep, warning rumble rolling from his chest. Jonah moved in, kicking the knife and the man's dropped pistol away. "Don't move," he said. He turned, sweeping his rifle up to cover Cole. Cole hadn't moved through any of it. He had his gun up now, sights on Jonah. "Lower it," Jonah said. "You first," Cole replied, his cheek twitching. Eclipse stamped again. Cole's muzzle drifted a hair toward the horse. "Don't," Jonah said, and in that single word was the ghost of another black horse on another battlefield. The moment stretched. Cole's gun dipped a fraction, Jonah's didn't. He stepped sideways, putting a shoulder of rock between himself and Cole's line of fire, shielding Clara and Eclipse. "On your knees." Cole smiled, a wintry, bitter thing. "No." Jonah shot. Not to kill. The bullet hit the snow a breath from Cole's boot. He froze, then slowly, as if his back had suddenly remembered gravity, he knelt. He placed his gun on the ground. "Hands," Jonah commanded. Cole laced them behind his head. "Clara," Jonah called, not taking his eyes off Cole. "You good?" Her breath trembled. "I'm here. I've got Reed." Jonah backed toward Eclipse, grabbing a coil of rope from his saddlebag. He moved fast, binding wrists tight and efficient. He tied Cole last. "You think this is over?" Cole murmured. "I think it ends," Jonah said. "How is up to you?" Clara eased off Reed, her body finally admitting the pain. Reed didn't resist as she tied his wrists. He spoke only once, his voice almost gentle. "Clarbear." She flinched. "No one's called me that in 15 years. He swallowed. "Yeah." When Jonah straightened, the clearing was an aftermath. 4 men, bound and sullen. Blood melting into the snow. Eclipse stood over it all, his sides rising and falling like a forge, steam making banners over his head. Jonah crossed to Clara. She was sitting in the snow now, the pistol resting across her thighs, her hands shaking. He crouched and put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You held your ground." She huffed a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "Barely. That's the only way anyone does." She nodded, her eyes bright with the strange relief of someone who has discovered they haven't died today. She looked past Jonah to Eclipse, to the great chest still heaving, the eyes cooling from fire to ember. She reached out a trembling hand. Eclipse stepped closer and lowered his head until her fingers found the warm velvet groove above his nose. He closed his eyes, like a prayer only horses know. The silence that follows violence is never gentle. It hangs heavy, thick with echoes. For a long time, the only sound was the soft whisper of falling snow settling over the wreckage of the fight. Jonah stood in the clearing, rifle loose in his hand, his eyes scanning the valley. Clara lay propped against the cave wall, blood dark against her bandages. Eclipse stood guard, steam billowing from his nostrils. Then a new sound crept into the stillness. Faint at first, then growing louder. A mechanical, rising and falling wail. A siren. It echoed along the ridges, muffled by snow. Flashes of blue and red pulsed between the trees. "Thank God," Clara whispered, her voice a rasp. Jonah knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Hold on. Help's here." Her cold fingers found his wrist and gripped it. He gripped back, grounding her. Eclipse lifted his head toward the lights, ears rigid. 2 snowmobiles burst from the tree line, followed by a column of tracked ATVs and uniformed officers. Federal Forest Patrol. At their center rode Lieutenant Maria Delgado, her gaze sharp and authoritative. She raised a fist and her squad fanned out, rifles up. But the scene that met them was not what they expected. 4 men, already bound. At the center of it all, a thin older man with a rifle, a wounded ranger, and a horse so large it seemed to eclipse the mouth of the cave. For a long beat, the patrol froze. Delgado's eyes flicked from the bound men to Jonah to Clara and finally settled on Eclipse. Her hand lowered. "Stand down," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air. The command spread through her squad, rifles dipped. "They did the job for us," Delgado murmured, her breath clouding. The process of reasserting order was swift. Shackles snapped around wrists. One officer pressed Cole's face into the snow. "This isn't over," Cole spat, his words muffled. "Oh, it's over for now," Jonah muttered, a deep weariness in his tone. Reed didn't resist, his eyes fixed on the ground, shame his only companion. Jonah stood off to the side, feeling Eclipse shift at his shoulder. He laid a hand on the horse's neck. "We held, boy." Eclipse shook his mane, a sound of agreement rumbling in his chest. Medics moved in, spreading a canvas stretcher for Clara. As they lifted her, she fought weakly against the straps, her hand shooting out toward Jonah. He caught it. "You didn't just save me," she rasped, her eyes gleaming. "You saved the forest." For the first time in too many winters, Jonah's face softened. He squeezed her hand, then let the medics take over. As they carried her toward a sled, Eclipse followed, his massive frame shadowing them. The soldiers stepped wide, their discipline cracking into awe. "That's no horse," one young officer blurted. "That's a guardian." The words hung in the air. A ripple of agreement moved through the squad. Delgado herself turned and inclined her head slightly toward Eclipse, a sign of respect from one warrior to another. Just then, another figure trudged through the snow, Sheriff Hank Lawson, his beard bristled with ice. His eyes took in the scene. He came to stand before Jonah. "The town needs a story like this," Lawson said, his voice low. "Let us honor him." His eyes flicked to Eclipse, then back to Jonah. His expression was carved from something older than duty. It was belief. Jonah had never wanted recognition. His life was built on shadows and silence. But now, with Clara's weak smile aimed at him and Eclipse standing tall and unbowed, he felt something shift. He swallowed, then tightened his hand on the reins. A wordless assent. The sheriff understood. He nodded, his own breath smoking in the dawn. The promise was made, the story would outlive them all. 3 days after the storm, the town of Stanley woke to a cold that felt clean. Snow sealed the town in, but the sky was a pale, rinsed blue. By late morning, the town square had been swept into a wide, packed oval. A wooden platform stood at the center, a hand-painted banner hung across its front. "Guardian of the Sawtooth." People came in twos and threes, their boots squeaking, their breath turning to fog. Farmers, loggers, teachers. The nervous energy was almost festive. This was a town that had been given back a piece of itself. Signs bobbed on sticks, drawn by children. "Thank you, Eclipse." One simply showed a big black horse with a very determined eye. A hush ran over the crowd when a short procession made its way in. 2 deputies, then Sheriff Lawson and Mayor Ruth Callahan. Behind them walked Clara Hayes on crutches, her face pale but set. At her shoulder, steady and silent, was Jonah McCreary. The applause started as a scatter, then grew, but all eyes were on what came behind them. A broad black shape that seemed to absorb the light. Eclipse stepped into the square. He was freshly brushed but not tamed. His scars were visible, his mane wild. He moved as if the square, the platform and the sky were all just part of a pasture he'd agreed to walk through. Mayor Callahan stepped to the microphone. "Neighbors," she began, her voice surprisingly strong. "We've come here to mourn in the past, but today we come to honor. That's rarer." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. This week, winter came hard, and men who thought these trees were theirs to take came harder. But something happened on that mountain. She paused. Hope came on 4 hooves this week. Hope reared against the storm and stood its ground. She spoke about Clara, who had stepped into her father's boots and nearly paid the price. She spoke about Jonah, a man who had tried to shrink his life but expanded it in one night to save another. "And above all," she said, turning toward the horse, "we honor the guardian who reminds us that the wild itself can stand with us." The square erupted. The church bell on the hill began to chime. Clara and Jonah climbed the steps. Clara spoke first, her voice frayed but clear. She told them how she thought she was alone until she wasn't. Then Jonah took the microphone, holding it as if it might bite. He looked at the town. "We didn't fight for glory," he said, his voice pure gravel. "We fought because the forest belongs to all of us." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Then the applause came again, louder this time. Sheriff Lawson stepped forward, unrolling a canvas cloth. In his hands lay a collar of dark handmade leather. On its brushed silver plate, deeply etched, were the words, "Guardian of the Sawtooth." He descended the steps and stood before Eclipse. The horse watched him, unblinking. Lawson lifted the collar and slipped it around Eclipse's massive neck. Just then, the sun broke from behind a cloud, striking the silver plate and sending a flash of white light into the air. The children cheered. Eclipse didn't toss his head or rear. He simply stood, lifted his head, and bared his great chest to the cold. For a brief, perfect second, he looked less like a horse and more like an answer. After the formalities, Clara found a bench at the edge of the square. Jonah stood beside her. The quiet between them was the kind you earn. "You didn't just give me a second chance," Clara said at last, her voice low. "You gave me back a father I thought I'd lost." Jonah studied his scarred hands. This wasn't a compliment, it was a naming. He let her words settle. "And you," he said, keeping his eyes on the square, "gave me a reason to keep standing. Hadn't had one in a while." Eclipse stepped in then, moving his great head over their shoulders, pressing his muzzle lightly to Clara's arm, then to Jonah's. The touch was light enough to be polite, heavy enough to be a bond. Clara laughed softly. Jonah put his palm against Eclipse's face and felt the heat, the breath, the life. People in Stanley would talk about that night for years. They would argue about how big Eclipse really was and whether he had actually roared. He had not. Horses don't. But something like it had rolled through the mountain anyway. They would tell their children that once, for a few hard days, the wild had chosen a side, and it had been theirs. Grace had come in a shape nobody expected. A scarred veteran, a stubborn ranger, and a black horse who stood his ground. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content.